I am Martín Tironi, and I work at the School of Design of Catholic University, and I wrote a paper for the special issue on Sociology of Testing about prototyping in urban space.
I'm Noortje. I'm director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick. And together with David Stark, I edited a special issue for the British journal Sociology on the new Sociology of Testing. So intelligent technologies used to be tested in the laboratory, but today they're tested in schools, they're tested in homes, in hospitals, and in the streets. And in my research, I investigate these new forms of technology testing beyond the laboratory in environments in society. Most recently, I've done that through field studies of street trials of self-driving cars in cities in the UK, in Coventry, London, Milton Keynes. What I'm interested in is how in these trials, the relation between technology and society is staged. Perhaps you could say curated, but also these trials are sites where we might be able to learn how these relations between technology and society are being actively reconfigured through the testing in society. Now, when you look at prevailing justifications of the testing of intelligent technology in society, these justifications are still very much technology-centered. So even if testing is located in society, it is the needs of technology and of technology development that continue to take center stage. So it is argued, for example, that testing of technology in society is required because it enables engineers to get better to take the social world into account as part of the design and implementation process. Another justification focuses on the needs of machines, on the requirements of machine learning, when it is said that testing on the open road is needed so that machines can learn how to take the social world into account. Now, in each of these justifications, society features very much as a kind of a passive background, as a silent stage for machines and engineering to perform on and in. However, when you observe street trials of intelligent vehicles in practice, so in the city streets of Coventry, the city where I work, for example, a very different picture emerges. So when intelligent vehicles appeared in the streets of Coventry in November of 2018, there was far more activity around the trials than one might expect on the basis of the type of justifications that I just recounted. For example, there were several reports, and there was quite a lot of reporting of the trials ongoing in social media, including through self-appointed sort of citizen journalism reports via Facebook Live. Now, in these reports, you get a different picture of what it means for self-driving vehicles to operate in a social environment. Because in these reports, it's very clear that for self-driving cars to be, to operate successfully in the social world, they are negotiating a diversity of viewpoints on self-driving cars. So there were remarks about the fact that the trials had not been announced to the public. There were jokes about drunk teenagers now being able to finally be as irresponsible as we know they are. Now, in this kind of reports, what I think is what becomes clear is that the definition of what it means for intelligent technology to successfully operate in the social world, that the definition of that success is no longer one that can be set through the engineering or the regulatory process. So I think the way to put it is that the way in which machines are and can be accountable to society through testing becomes very clearly something that is negotiated among diverse actors in street trials and in these tests conducted beyond the laboratory. And that kind of diversification of the actors involved in technological accountability is what for me makes street testing so important, and where I also see the role for sociology to demonstrate that transformation of the accountability of technology once testing moves beyond the laboratory.
Thanks, Noortje. Maybe I'm going to ask you something about your research, but first of all, I'm going to present my research on testing. So since I arrived to the School of Design of Catholic University 5-6 years ago, I have been interested in the materiality and the idea of prototype as an epistemic and speculative object that you can work with and analyze. As you know, the use of prototype as a testing instrument has become a common strategy in the domain of innovation, service design, and increasingly in the implementation of smart technology and urban policy through living labs or pilot intervention. So in my paper for the special issue that you conduct on Sociology of Testing, I developed an argument based on an urban intervention carried out in Santiago of Chile. I analyzed the technique of prototyping as a political device that can make visible or invisible certain entities and issues, determining what the experimental entities, in this case the prototype used for this intervention, that engage in the process of testing, and what these entities can do and say. More specifically, I explored two ambivalent capacity of testing with prototype. On the one hand, I analyzed testing prototype as a management and enrollment mechanism that seek to prescribe normativities. I call this a problem validating prototype. The politics of this form of testing arise from their capacity to manage and nudge in order to prescribe ideas and colonize spaces, reducing the multiplicity and different friction and conflict that you can find in the scenario. But on the other hand, I also explore the testing prototype as an event that can make friction tangible, articulating matter of concern and way to open alternative scenario. So in this paper, I call this capacity as a problem-making prototype. Here, the prototype are not a strategy for finding a given reality or transforming it under predefined imperative. Rather, this prototype evoke and provoke issues that do not fall within parameters set by the expert. So this form of operating prototype forces us to recognize entities, visions, and problems that had been ignored and promoting engagement with unexpected and maybe recalcitrant scenario of interventions that go beyond this logic of dominant solutionism. So in short, and maybe related with what you say in your presentation of your work, my research of testing focus on understanding how testing devices present an ontological and political capacity to create walls, to make explicit or invisible reality that had not previously existed.
Because with the pandemic, testing, and in the UK also very much not testing for COVID has really emerged as an enduring and central concern, in the public's response to the pandemic. Now, much of the debate about testing focuses on the types of tests and the types of testing infrastructures that are and are not available in the current moment. So antibody testing versus PCR testing, or symptom tracing via apps. But from the sociology of testing, from that perspective, what is, I think, equally striking is the locations in which testing for COVID is now expected to take place. And I see there a lot of sort of resonance with the debates about testing beyond the laboratory in our special issue on the new sociology of testing. Because in the case of COVID-2, testing is now expected to take place and is taking place in schools, in homes, in hospitals, and in the streets, as well as in parking lots and shopping malls and many locations beyond the laboratory like this. However, from the very start that the very start of the pandemic and the very start of the insight that testing beyond the laboratory was going to be crucial to the management of the pandemic, different ideal visions of testing arose, and I think have really persisted and held sort of a grip on the public imagination. And I think one way you can capture that ideal is as testing made easy. That somehow moving testing beyond the laboratory into social environments like schools and community centers, that this would be accompanied somehow by technologies that would make testing easy, that would allow everyone to test quickly without needing lots of expertise. And the image that always comes to mind for me is that of Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, declaring that testing would become as easy as taking a pregnancy test. And it's perhaps especially memorable because at the same time, he is the politician, who is often discussed in relation to pregnancy testing and the way in which he has been tested by various former partners becoming pregnant. So there was some irony there, but also more seriously, this notion of testing made easy has both remained very strong, but also is one where I think the sociology of testing can make a real contribution in helping us come to terms with that ideal. Because in the context of a reality where testing remains in short supply, and where testing also reveals to depend on long supply chains and good communications between laboratories and, for instance, GP practices in society. I think what we're witnessing is a very strong and powerful demonstration of how this ideal of testing made easy, that moving testing out of the laboratory would somehow coincide with testing working like a off-the-shelf consumer product, that equation, it doesn't hold, and it very visibly is being devalidated, I think, in the everyday. So the ideal for testing made easy, when you look at other domains of medical practice, like pregnancy, that ideal is often tied with a vision of testing in private, of individuals taking charge of testing, perhaps user-led testing as an individual affair, where then again society doesn't really enter into the equation of testing. Society there too is like a silent stage on which testing takes place. Yet what we see when we look at discourses about testing in society today in the time of COVID is that we see this vision really being undone in all manner of ways. So this summer I conducted a short research project on COVID testing and everyday reporting around COVID testing on Twitter. And what emerged there very clearly is the incredible array of social actors and societal actors that are and get invoked in everyday accounts about testing for COVID in society. So school teachers, taxi drivers, nurses, local government, NHS, the role of GP practices, the range of social actors that are directly and explicitly sort of brought into the story of testing beyond the laboratory in society is really striking. From, I think, the perspective of sociology, what makes it so striking is that this idea of testing made private, testing beyond the laboratory as something that is user-led and thereby also involves a self-responsibilization of users, that theme, which in sociology has often been considered as very powerful in today's society, has been really sort of shining in its absence. So what can sociology, what lessons does sociology hold for COVID? An important lesson, I think, is the way in which testing beyond the laboratory will not equate to a testing in private, or even a privatization of testing. So notwithstanding the UK government's attempt to remove the responsibility for testing from public sector bodies and public institutions like local government and the NHS, and the attempt to displace the responsibility for the creation of testing infrastructure to private companies like Serco, the security company. Notwithstanding all these efforts, testing for COVID is revealed every day to be a thoroughly societal affair. Testing for COVID puts everyday people in a very direct and explicit relation with institutional actors like hospitals and schools, and state actors like central government, but also other levels of government. So to just wrap this up, perhaps we could even say that in the case of COVID, we can see that testing beyond the laboratory now amounts to a kind of a socialization of testing. Yes. So it exposes the ability or inability of actors to take responsibility for others. So it is a distinctively social mode of responsibilization that comes with testing beyond the laboratory. One where the distribution of the ability to test or not test places actors in a relation of responsibility, of irresponsibility. So either responsibility or irresponsibility to others. And so that is also to say that COVID does not exactly put actors to the test in the kind of heroic version of the story that newspapers are somehow fond of telling, where the great leaders their capacity to lead is somehow challenged by COVID. It's not so much individuals, but relations that are put to the test through COVID, that our capacities of actors to take responsibility for other actors are revealed to be relational accomplishment. And they derive indeed in part from how access to testing is distributed across society.
Wow. So I would like to react to your comment, Noortje. It's very difficult because you just mentioned many powerful ideas, but maybe I would like to comment and maybe ask about your argument that I think is very, very important to sociology of testing, on this idea of everyday testing beyond the laboratory that COVID crisis has generated in our society, in the world. In a way, this idea of testing beyond the laboratory invite us to explore different mode of externalization of the idea of laboratory. As you indicate, at home, school, office, museum, parking lots, and so on. I think that this process of externalization of the laboratory in the daily life has this ability that you has worked before to reconnect science and institutional actors with people daily lives in the ordinary life, redefining the relationship and meanings that science has in society. So I would like to put forward and I want to ask you two things. So first of all, I think that it's interesting. One interesting aspect of everyday testing beyond the laboratory is based on the assumption that it's possible to scale or maybe move from individual framework of the problem to a more collective framework through a collective process of learning. This is what I think. So my question is, what kind of learning and form of maybe counter expertise can generate people themselves by this process of socialization of testing? Or maybe to put in another way, how this process of socialization of testing that you mentioned can inform official institution and create new form of understanding the pandemic crisis. So this is my third question.
So I think it's very interesting you bring up the notion of laboratorization. So the idea that if testing is done in environments in society, that this would somehow turn social environments into places that are look more like laboratories. So this is the well-known claim by actor network theory from the 1980s. One of the points I make together with David Stark in the introduction to the special issue on the sociology of testing is that this idea that testing beyond the laboratory amounts to a laboratorization of society, that in that proposition suggests that we already know what is the outcome by introducing testing beyond the laboratory, that somehow society would become more like science. What I think is very important in the current moment is that we see that the actors that have stepped in to take responsibility for testing beyond the laboratory, and indeed all those actors who are the agents of testing beyond the laboratory in the time of COVID, they are not scientists. They don't wear the hat of science. They are nurses, teachers, I mean, these are the two figures that figure very prominently also perhaps in my world. So that's why I mentioned them, but there are many other social actors like that step in. And I think that is where this idea of the socialization of testing is then also perhaps the counterpart to this idea of the laboratorization of society. That because it also means that if we understand a society where testing beyond the laboratory has become routine, or has may become something mundane, like properly every day, that is a society, not a scientific society in the sense of we are governed by experts, but it is a society where the expertise for detecting the unknown properties of phenomena, which is testing, is an expertise that belongs to being a nurse, that belongs to being a teacher. So in that sense, it's perhaps also a kind of a call on sociologists, and I would include myself in that, to perhaps not only focus on expertise and counter-expertise as the moment where science and society are brought in relation, but that it is really this competence, the epistemic competence that is distributed in a very different way, where it is these social roles that very much include that scientific competence.
Yeah, and related with that, Noortje, I have another question, or maybe comment. So if the coronavirus crisis has generated this process that you mentioned of socialization of testing, that is a way of open source science beyond the laboratory, redefining the position of power of the laboratory in society, my question is, what features or what socio-technical transition do you think that can emerge from this process of relocalizing the position of laboratory in society? Do you think that we are in phase of a kind of socio-technical transition? Yes, this is maybe it's a little bit ambitious, my question, but
well, no, I think there are very good elements in it, and it's very important. I think the first reminder is that where testing is done beyond the laboratory, this does not mean that the laboratory disappears or becomes less important. So I think what also has become clear throughout the pandemic is how much credible infrastructures, like effective infrastructures for testing beyond the laboratory, are very, very much dependent on the ability to send samples to the laboratory. And so it is in that sense, it's not necessarily a de-laboratorization of society, to use the term that Michael Guggenheim has put forward. But in terms of the social technical, the prevailing and overriding reality, at least from where I sit, is very much that of a shortage of testing. Even though everyone knows that one can carry COVID without showing symptoms, in the UK, testing is still limited to those with symptoms, and so it is also at my university. So the shortage of testing, the requirements on testing being obviously not comprehensive enough. So there are many people of which we know they probably carry the disease who are not even able to get a test. I mean, I think it really forcefully puts front and center. I think the under-equipped, the lack of equipment, the way in which our infrastructures and our arrangements are under-equipped. And I think that is a problem that perhaps especially in the North, sociologists of science have been inclined, also in the traditions that I'm familiar with, to speak of a kind of an abundance of the abundant science. Like we were always more scientific in our procedures and ways of doing in Western societies than was good for us. That seemed to be the kind of one of the principal messages of the sociology of science. And so I think this lack of equipment, the under-equipment, what is the kind of scientific society where we are really capable of staring that in the face? That for me is very much a question, the question of transition of the future, of are we equipped to confront that poverty, which for sociology is, I think, very challenging, because sociology has been such a critic of technocracy, of expertise, of always the too much science, too much reason.
So it's my turn to try to respond to the question, what are the learning that my research of testing hold to the COVID crisis? So I would like to say three things based on my research on testing that are very related with what you mentioned, I think. First of all, I believe that the COVID crisis has shown how the notion of test has more structural and total nature that we tend to think. We can say that coronavirus crisis is providing Michel Calon right. We need to pay more attention to the degree to which we are becoming a society of ongoing testing, a laboratory on a planetary scale, and so a technical democracy which must deal with increasingly levels of complexity and uncertainty. We have seen the world of test and its associated protocol, techniques, and value become a part of everyday speech, as you mentioned before. It has become one of the main control mechanisms of the pandemic. In other words, the idea of ongoing testing has become a sort of moral imperative that is inseparable from a scientific or technical narrative of social life in which all individuals are put to the test, which they might approve or disapprove of, and that validate their condition as a healthy citizen. The second interesting element for me is to try to understand how this testing imperative articulate a social and maybe institutional dimension with a very existential dimension of society. It is interesting how a specific device, the testing device, become a kind of boundary object between state control over the population and individuals' situated and mundane experience. So the process of testing the population is more than just an institutional and technological challenge. It's also a social challenge in terms of the unequal way in which the testing technology is distributed in society. This is particularly strong and evident in Latin America, where the work of traceability is very unequal among cities and countries. In that sense, the proliferation of the idea of COVID tests articulate structural an institutional process as well as a personal experience of failure, vulnerability, or maybe lack of protection that we have seen in our day. And finally, I think that it's interesting to analyze the demonstrative effect of the idea of testing. In other words, from one day to the next, the number of tests that governments can conduct become a bar or become a standard for evaluating the democratic and technical quality of a nation. As you know, society are always testing their citizens at the school, at the work, at the family, at home. But now the act of testing the population become a matter of life or death, a matter of exclusion, inclusion, thanks to the COVID crisis. And as the sociology of testing have shown, the act of testing must always be analyzed in function of the audience or public that one wish to convince or create, and the type of power relationship that are inscribed in the formulation of the test.
Yeah, I've two responses slash questions, and maybe I too can take them one by one. So the first is that I think you're pointing at some real tensions opened up by testing, and perhaps it is even what we could call it the ambivalence of testing. That on the one hand, testing is a form of governance. It is a way to manage a population, both the population as audience, but also population as kind of the collective at risk. But at the same time, testing, I think also in what you just said, is revealed to be very empowering. Now, if one has access to a test, one gains a knowledge which allows one to act responsibly. So if testing is a kind of, it's I think in a COVID situation also, when we look at the inequality of access to testing, we can still see this kind of empowerment through testing. So the first point I wanted to put to you is, do you, how can you keep both these dimensions of testing in society in your mind at the same time? Like that on the one hand, testing is a way of staging to a population, a government that is equipped to keep people safe. And on the other hand, that testing does have this empowerment and this sort of emancipatory capacity. Now, do you feel that you can hold both at the same time?
It's a very good question. I think I am trying to think that maybe we can think this virus, this crisis, as a matter of care, you know, because so the government that are developing this testing technology over the population is because they are worried about us, and so we must to take care, we must to use and be a good citizen to protect ourselves of the coronavirus. But in the same times, in our mundane life, in the ordinary life, we are developing different skills and tools to deal with this crisis, and are tools that go beyond what the state are saying. So each family, each individual has his own knowledge and way to deal with this invisible force. And so for me, it's very powerful to see how people are talking about this invisible force all the time. And you can see different theory about what it is, this virus. And sometimes it's matched with the state, and sometimes it's a completely bifurcation about what the state is saying. So I think that maybe this notion of Maria Puig de Belacaz about how we can think the coronavirus as a matter of care for people and also for the state.
Yeah, no, I think that's really a very good way to remind us also of not overestimating the the power of the test. So what I also hear you say is that there are so many ways that are being invented at the moment of coping well that do not necessarily involve testing. So this kind of the way in which, you know, acting on the basis of conclusive evidence, which is, you know, in liberal democracies, such a powerful ideal that we also see many habits forming today that don't rely on that ideal.
Yeah, completely. And also, I think that maybe one of the most difficult challenge is how we define the problem. Because there's many ways to define what is the cause of this crisis and how we can resolve this crisis. So the definition of the problem is the problem, maybe. And maybe all this technology of testing is just one way to define the problem. And maybe we need to expand the tools to maybe to test not just ourselves, but maybe our community, our way to talk with the virus and with the neighbors and so on. I have a question to you, because you mentioned something that for me is very important. You said that when you are involved in this process of trial in the street trials with autonomous vehicle, you said that it's a privileged moment to see how different actors are related, how different actors are confront. And I want to ask you about non-human actors. How you deal with these non-human actors that are involved in these street trials? And maybe I can ask you, what do you think about these non or more than human actors that are involved in this testing that we are doing with ourselves?
Yeah. I mean, if I put it in a technical language, I see these tests in society, in environments in society, as a kind of an empirical occasion. So an occasion in which the entities that participate in sustaining a particular reality, so for instance that of automotive mobility, that those actors become specified at the occasion of the test. So we might think that innovations in mobility are all about introducing new machine learning algorithms into vehicles or developing new AI-informed methodologies of computer vision. But at the occasion of the test in the street, you will see how the curbs along the sidewalks, the signage on the street that may or may not be present because of the budget cuts no longer enabling the local government to put that signage on the street. How all those very specific entities participate in this reality or in this proposition. Now, I put it now quite technically, and I wish my language weren't so technical, so I always search for other language. But in putting it this way, you know, it is clear that non-human actors play a very important part. So one of the actors that I'm very taken in by is fences and fencing. So that the fencing off of the street somehow it demarcates like which entities are an official part of the script of the test, and then there are all these entities that do participate in the test, like through filming it, or but they somehow are separated by the fence. And the fence features very prominently in, I think, as a demonstration also of that demarcation work that gets done as part of test curation through engineering. So when it comes of lessons of COVID for sociology, I feel that we've already started the conversation about that. I can try and sum up my view by raising 2 points. The first is one I already mentioned, that is the point of not testing, the shortage of tests, the inability or the difficulty in accessing tests. And I've already mentioned that I really struck by how powerful a reality that is. Partly, of course, because of that vital importance of testing that you mentioned, Martin, but also because I think it poses a real challenge to the sociology of testing, which is a proudly empirical sociology. So the famous studies in the sociology of testing from the late 70s onwards, most of them are based on fieldwork at test sites or very detailed archival studies of particular tests. And it is always the test that is the object of fascination in that strand in the sociology of testing. So, you know, what are the methods and the concepts that would really allow us to understand and describe not testing as a social reality, and one that also very much defines the role and the place of science in society. Because of course the sociology of testing is very closely connected to the sociology of science more broadly and debates around the democratization of science. And I think there too that the sort of the lack of access to particular devices, equipment, it strikes me that it hasn't featured very prominently as a challenge to the democratization of science. Usually the challenge of to the democratization of science is imagined in terms of the types of knowledge that everyday actors are or are not sort of capable of engaging with. So I find that a really, for me, that is a very important lesson of COVID. Also in terms of the methods, how do you actually study not testing? What is a field study of not testing? The second point is quite a general one, but to me still very important. It's the critique in sociology of government by expert, or the critiques of technocracy. It's a very long-standing critique in sociology. It goes back to the 19th century, early 20th century, sort of the founding sociologies imply often a critique of government by expert. And what COVID makes me once again question the sociological impulse to decry this over-reliance on experts in governance as what silences democracy. Because I think there is plenty of silencing of democracy that we can observe, often very concretely, in this age of COVID. But I'm really less and less convinced that the presence of experts in government are the sort of principal reason, or the most worthy focus of critique in that regard. And I really do feel that in sociology we have reconstructive work to do in terms of reconstructing our concepts and perhaps also our impulses in that regard. So I only wish that we had a functioning test and trace system in Britain. When we speak about the silencing of democracy, we should speak about the expansion in a jurisdiction of government that is just claimed by government. Yes, to be sure, like there is a very blatant democratic deficits that can be observed there. But in terms of like how we define the problem, these are problems with the politics of collective action, and how collective action can be a democratic accomplishment or not. That's what we're talking about there. And so I think the sort of reflex, which I have seen in the debate, to say, we are governed by technocrats and that is the problem, is really, it shows and reveals an inability or sort of lack of exercise in the ability to distinguish between different types of technological politics in sociology. So there are types and forms of technological politics that are very technological and very expert intensive and not necessarily anti-democratic. And how we can specify that and how we can learn to distinguish between forms of competence that make stuff work well for society and in society, and forms of competence and expertise that limit those possibilities. I think those kinds of distinctions are very important for us to learn how to make, and I will continue to search for ways in which we can practice a sociology that can contribute to that.
So I think your approach or your reflection on this relationship between technocracy, this idea that I think is very powerful of politics of responsabilization, and the link with the testing or private testing, I was wondering if you can try to think your conceptualization with this idea, this old idea of Don Dewey, and this idea of politics of experimentation. I am referring here with the idea that politics for Dewey must be open to the experimentation, because the problem and their public concern emerged, as you know, in this process of co-articulation or co-formation through the process of inquiry and problematization. That is, instead of considering the end of politics as something given, Dewey talk about the need to test those ends based on the experience and the problems that emerge in each situation. In the situation, for example, that we are living. I would like to quote John Dewey to be more provocative. Quote, "The formation of the state must be an experimental process. And since conditions of action on and of inquiry and knowledge are always changing, the experiment must always be retried. The state must always be rediscovered. End of quote." So my question is, how we can think with John Dewey to understand this proliferation of little or relocalization of the test experience in society. For example, we need to redefine, or we need to experiment with the state for think more than human futures, because now we are living this crisis because a virus who are redesigning our society, and it's a non-human actor who are redefining the way in which we are living. So this is my question and maybe provocation.
Yeah, no, it's really good, because I mean, it strikes me first that you know, experimentation is for many connected with an inability to take responsibility. Like experimentation is in society, there is an association with lack of responsibility. You know, also empirically, when we look at you know, the beta testing of technologies in social environments, before these technologies are properly tested in the lab, we say that is irresponsible because we don't know if it's safe. And I think there's certainly an element of irresponsibility there. But what I think is so interesting about Dewey's argument, as you just outlined it, is that he turns that around. So the starting point for Dewey is that the state is not capable of taking responsibility for the new types of public problems that arise in technological societies. And I've always found that like a most crucial starting point, which is very different from where political theory starts from. You know, political theory always starts from demonstrating what is a legitimate state, therefore a capable state. For Dewey, we start from the state is not capable of taking responsibility. And again, I find this very aptly describes our condition in relation to COVID, but also in relation to climate change. So where do we go from this point? The state is currently not equipped to take responsibility. So this also gives experimentation in society a different status, because it will then, to experiment in society is a way of trying out, of seeking out, exploring possible ways of acting on problems that the state is not capable of acting upon. So experimentation in society in that logic is not a irresponsible playfulness on the part of citizens who should really leave these inquiries to certified actors. It is a kind of a necessary trying out of different possible ways of engaging with the problem. Like, there is no other way than through experimentation in society that we can hope to address the public problems of technological societies. And I still very much, underwrite that. I think it is still the right diagnosis for our times. But when we connect it with the localization of testing in society, I do think that in the empirical studies that are being conducted today by sociologists on testing in society, but also in the laboratory, that we do see that these sort of ability to take responsibility, that capacity is very asymmetrical in how it is distributed. There are many actors who experiment who are utterly incapable of taking responsibility. And I mean, I think digital sociology is full of examples of people being eaten alive by predators in the zoo because they were using their selfie stick in the wrong way. I mean, that's a kind of a exemplar of irresponsibility. And I know that the question of responsibility can very quickly turn into a kind of a patronizing or even sort of patriarchal kind of question. So I want to be very careful with that language, but at the same time, I do think it is the language of our moment, and it is also where this relational sociology, so a sociology that locates responsibility in a relation, is so important. So responsibility is not one actor having the capacity to take care of another. It is that through interdependence, we are in these relations of mutual obligation, and the capacity to live well with that in a society where risk and harm are so abundant. I really do think that is our question, and that is a different one from Dewey's questions, because Dewey did. His philosophy used to be bit dismissively be referred to as the philosophy of problem solving, but it is true that pragmatism from the early 20th century did have a very optimistic understanding and sort of assessment of how through experimentation we would solve our problems. And I do think it's right to say that we have a far better sense today of how much harm and damage can be done through experimentation as well. So I think it's that, go with Dewey in this assessment of the relation between the state and the public, but we do need to see the bad of experimentation as well as the good.
So what can sociology of testing learn from the current crisis? For me, the crisis that we are living reveals two aspects that are important for sociology of testing. First, I believe that this crisis shows how the idea of test is always support or is always enfolded by a specific narrative. To put it differently, a test is not only a measurement technique, it's always accompanied by a concept of society and its individuals. This crisis has demonstrated a clear hegemony of scientific narration with all the benefits and implications that this has for society. That means a specific definition of the idea of testing that maybe is different that the ones that we can recognize in other tradition or cosmovision. In that sense, I believe that this crisis invites us to explore, to study empirically a sort of governance through testing that imply specific values, discourses, practices, and maybe imaginaries of the future. Finally, and for me it's very important, I think that it's interesting to analyze how the COVID crisis has turned society, and specifically urban territory, into a testing lab for new solutions. The crisis offers opportunity to test new vision, new solution that allows us to move to our, for example, post-carbon or post-car world, rethink our culture of hyperconsumption, or test out form of circular economy based on care, repair, and so on. So I would like to think this pandemic crisis as opportunity to test and prototype new models of development. It is an opportunity to test a society oriented toward repairing and caring life on the planet instead of its appropriation and instrumentalization. In that sense, the idea of test can help to redefine new way of relating to the environment and to begin to explore other possible futures. We cannot allow this crisis to create a sort of collective fatality or process of defuturing, as Tony Fry called it, as a result of the inability or incapability to test out other possibility. Here is where I see a challenge for interdisciplinary methods or for interdisciplinary research, and it has to do with learning to work with situation of uncertainty, to work with experimental intervention that allows us to materialize and test maybe counter-hegemonic and alternative futures.
To speak of experimental culture, for many people is to speak of a kind of a progressive, middle class, maybe also white kind of culture. One colleague of mine he mentions the example, or it's an exchange I had with him briefly, where I said, oh, there's this fabulous Dutch writer who did this fantastic experiment. He released some chickens on an Amsterdam canal, which mobilized the police in great numbers, and it was a fantastic demonstration of the Netherlands as a kind of a police state in a very literal sense. And then my colleague just said, well, clearly this was a white novelist. Imagine if anyone else would release some chickens on the canal, and what would happen then? And I think this is very important in terms of these, how the capacity to experiment is distributed, what gets recognized as an experiment and what gets recognized or put down as a mere disturbance. But also in relation to COVID, I do wonder whether this kind of, the way in which normality so clearly doesn't obtain today, in these months, in this period, where so much of how things were usually done are not done that way, whether there's perhaps a possibility that this notion that experimental culture is only for, you know, the creative class or the progressives, or whether there can be a shift in the place of experimenting culture. But then also, what would it require of us to help that, to make that happen? I mean, I'm also reminded in your paper, in the special issue, where there are taxi drivers who become very impatient with the sustainable city experiment, because the cycling paths are making it much harder for them to pick up customers, if I'm right. So how do you sort of see this hope for a different future delivered through experimentation within that context of these class wars?
I think that you mentioned a very sensible and important point related about of how the notion of the culture of experimentation is very related to a special or creative class, white and or creative people who has a lot of projects, and they are thinking in this experimentation way of life. But I think that maybe we need to try to decolonize this notion of experimenting in the way that when we use the notion of experimentation, is always related with something new. We need to create a new idea or new technology, or something new, this kind of obsession with the new. And maybe we need to separate, to distinguish between experimentation as something new, and maybe we need to try to explore other way of inventing, of creating, that is not inscribed in this linear way of thinking that is related with innovation or maybe with experimentation. So I am agree with you that the notion of experimentation sounds very elitist maybe, and maybe there is a talent and to try to decolonize this notion and try to see empirically how it's used by ordinary people, working class. And yeah, I don't know if I answered your provocation, but
yeah, no, you did. And I think it also makes the connection with things we discussed previously about the way the ability to test is distributed across society now, where the nurse and the teacher, they are the agents of testing now in my world. So I think what we're saying about the capacities for experimentation and how they can be distributed and redistributed, there's a similar point being made. And this is I think also why doing or participating or observing experimentation in society is so important, because through our description of different agents in society taking on that role as the active testing subject, we can I think also help show how this is already very much a reality, even though the resources are not perhaps distributed in that way.